Let's talk about Street Fighter. Street Fighter is the biggest fighting game franchise in the world. From defining the genre of fighting games with Street Fighter 2 to saving the fighting game community with Street Fighter 4, Street Fighter has earned its place at the top of the fighting game pedestal as the most iconic franchise for fighting games. However, that doesn't mean it hasn't had its rough patches, with games like Street Fighter 3 The New Generation and Street Fighter 5's release being received extremely poorly. In fact, Street Fighter V's launch was so bad, most people to this day still think it's a terrible game that should be avoided at all costs. So when Capcom were making their next game in the beloved series, they needed to make sure that it would make waves across the gaming world. Have it absolutely eradicate any negative stigma that Street Fighter V left and usher in a new era of dominance for the Street Fighter franchise. So how did Capcom do? Well, Capcom has gone absolutely ham on Street Fighter 6, from the visuals to the sound effects, to the single-player mode, to the character creation, netcode, redesigns, community interaction, marketing, leaning into the jury fans' foot fetish. Capcom pulled out all of the stops to make sure that Street Fighter 6 had the best chance of doing well in the current gaming landscape, while still making sure that the game appealed to the fans of the previous entries. But how did they do that? What was their radical new take on Street Fighter that made new people want to come over to the game while still keeping the old fans invested? Well, all it took was some remaining characters, some very unique and inspiring new faces, and 6 green bars. This is the drive gauge and is the most important thing in Street Fighter 6. Most of your character's universal tools are linked to the drive gauge in some way. EX moves are no longer linked to Super Meter like they are in every Street Fighter since Street Fighter 3. Now you can empower your moves by spending 2 blocks of the drive gauge to get an OD version of your move. Speaking of Street Fighter 3, parries are back from Street Fighter 3. However, they function very differently. While not removing all push block like it did in Street Fighter 3, you still go way less of a distance than you did if you were to just block it normally. You also take no chip damage to your drive gauge when blocking an ability. Parries are also not activated by pressing forward when the attack connects. Now you have to hold both medium attacks, so you go into a parry stance. The initial parry activation costs half a block of drive gauge, and the longer you hold the parry, the more of the drive gauge that you drain. However, every attack that is successfully parried fills the drive gauge back up. You can also perform a perfect parry by parrying an attack right as the attack is about to hit you. Perfect parries have literally 0 push block when activated, and they also allow you to act instantly out of the parry animation. They also have the added benefit of costing basically 0 drive gauge, as the parry cost is almost instantly restored by the perfect parry. Parry also gives you access to another mechanic with the drive gauge. By pressing forward twice, you are able to activate a drive cancel, where your character becomes covered in slime and you begin hurling towards your opponent with murderous intent. This can be activated in 2 ways, from a drive parry, like we already talked about, which costs 1 block of the drive gauge, and from specific cancelable normals, which cost 3 blocks, aka half of your entire drive gauge. The cancel obviously gives you some positional advantage and the ability to continue your pressure where it otherwise would have stopped. However, if you use a normal attack after going into the drive cancel, the actual frame advantage of that normal move is then increased, meaning that you can get positive on block pressure. It's basically an extremely good version of Street Fighter 4's focus attack dash cancel. Speaking of things that are good, Drive Impact is an armored move that allows you to take 3 hits before receiving any damage. If you absorb any damage during the start of the move, you cause your enemy to enter a crumpled state, where you can hit them with a massive free combo, and it only costs 1 drive gauge. It is, again, very similar to Street Fighter 4's focus attack. Now this is the one that a lot of people point to and call bullshit, but let's be honest, if you're getting hit by this consistently, it's kind of your own fault. Drive Impact is a pretty slow move for fighting game standards, and it has the easiest counter in the world. Just Drive Impact back. Beating a Drive Impact with your own Drive Impact leads to a really cool slowdown effect, where you as the person countering the Drive Impact feel really cool, and your opponent who decided to try a raw Drive Impact can feel their pants changing from a denim blue to a muddy brown. Finally, we have the Drive Reversal, which is the only mechanic that I can find to survive the Street Fighter V slaughter, and even then technically it's an Alpha Series move. By pressing forward and both heavy kicks while in block stun, you instantly cancel your block stun and get your opponent off of you for 2 blocks of the drive gauge. This is just nice to have. A universal defensive option while in block stun is something that I personally, things make fighting games better in general. So I'm glad that we were able to keep this from Street Fighter V, while the rest of the V-skill system went the way of Freddy Fazbear.
For most of you, I believe there is peace, and perhaps more, waiting for you after the smoke clears. Although for one of you, the darkest pit of hell has opened to swallow you whole. So don't keep the devil waiting, friend.
So how does the gauge actually work? Well, the gauge naturally refills over the course of the match, as long as you're not blocking. If you do block, you will lose part of the drive gauge, and if you get punish countered, you lose a heavy amount of the drive gauge. If you also get hit with supers, then you lose a bunch of the drive gauge. And if you run out of drive gauge, you enter a state called burnout, which is a very important state that we'll cover later. But how much bar do you start with? Does it start empty and fill over the match like basically every other fighting game, so that the game gets more complex the more the game goes on? No, of course not. This is Street Fighter 6. Your gauge starts out completely full and refills after every round. And now we can finally begin to appreciate the genius of this system. Normally in Street Fighter, there's a bit of a disconnect between how all of its systems work. You start the match with nothing. Your EX specials and supers are linked, however, the way that you build them is just by attacking. The only downside to blocking things is that you're going to take chip damage, and if you take too many hits, you'll end up getting stunned, which is never a good feeling. All of these mechanics are still in Street Fighter 6, however, the way that the systems interact with each other is vastly different. Even the simplest of changes, like finally having the divorce proceedings of the EX moves and super bar finalized, has a massive ramification on how the game plays and feels. Before, you had to make conscious decisions on how you wanted to spend your meter every time you wanted to go for a more powerful special move. Let's say that you're fighting against a Guile and they're doing their best turtle impression and telling you about their favorite Wii U game. In most fighting games, when a projectile clashes, they both cancel each other out as soon as they connect. This leads to the funny fireball war between characters that all Street Fighter fans are familiar with. However, Capcom at some point decided to get a little bit quirky with how they wanted fireballs to work, and we finally have fireballs that have a bit more staying power. Instead of disappearing after one hit, like the awkward interaction where you're both trying to get past the other person but you keep moving in the same direction, some characters have fireballs that are able to simply mow down other fireballs on their way to their target. Akuma's red fireball is a pretty good example of this, having naturally more hits by default but taking longer to start up. However, in later Street Fighter games, basically every character with a fireball has a way to deal with other fireballs with EX fireballs. Basically, these fireballs just have more hits than usual. However, since EX moves cost a block of the super gauge, you have to weigh up if spending the meter is a good idea to win the war, as you'll be left without the ability to use your super and have to build the gauge back up. So how does it work in Street Fighter 6? Well, since the gauges are separated, you can use an an OD version of your move as long as you're not in burnout, giving you the opportunity to win the fireball wall at any point of the match without having to affect your super gauge, which is honestly a great change. However, because OD moves cost 2 blocks of the drive gauge, it isn't even the best option to deal with the projectiles. In fact, most players like to actually parry the fireball and walk forward to close the gap. Now, obviously, not every character wants to do this. Strong projectile-based characters probably want to throw fireballs from far away, so keeping their distance and spamming them with OD might be the better option. But if your character works better at close range, or hell, even just mid-range, it's generally smarter to just parry the fireball so you lose less ground while parrying, and activating the parry costs half a block of the drive gauge. And parrying a fireball will give you half a block back, so you basically lose no meter. Plus, if you perfect parry the fireball, you can act out of it immediately, which gives you this image of a character just not fucking stopping. There's also an OS where you can perfect parry a fireball and cancel into a drive rush for 1 bar, but considering that I'm making this video like a day before the game comes out, I haven't really done that tech yet. Did you see it? Instead of having the splitting of the system cause players to have similar options that lead to less decision making, Capcom managed to craft a system that allows for players to have multiple different options with how they want to deal with something as simple as fireball spam. Do you want to win the fireball war and send back your own projectiles, or do you want to use the more cost-efficient method that allows you to control the ground and threaten your opponent with a safe approach? Hell, it even asks if you have the skill to perfect parry the fireball and get in without needing to slow down after every projectile, meaning that players that master the timing of the parries will have an extremely threatening option of getting in against projectile-based characters. This is also ignoring the fact that you can call out your opponent's fireball up close and just But this is ignoring some situations. Like, we're mostly assuming right now that you have a full or mostly full drive gauge to fight back with. It could be that you instead are on low drive meter and need to still get past a wall of projectiles. You can't block them because if you block special moves, it lowers your drive gauge, and this could put you into burnout. So you need to find a way to deal with it. Maybe instead of winning the fireball war with your EX, you actually decide that it is best to keep the drive gauge and try to parry the fireballs, even if it would be more beneficial for you to throw out that OD. Or maybe you do the opposite and decide that you can actually outlast the burnout timer if you win the fireball war once. So you decide to throw out an OD move and decide to play a safe game where you attempt to keep the opponent out without backing yourself too far into the corner. Since the game allows you to overspend your drive gauge, you gain the ability to use any option even if you technically couldn't afford it, with the downside of course being that you're put into burnout. Now let's talk about burnout. Burnout is an interesting state because while, yeah, it sucks being in burnout, it's not an automatic end of the game state. In fact, it can be quite the opposite. While in burnout, every attack hit against you gains 4 additional plus frames of block stun, meaning that strings that weren't true before are unescapable now, and moves that wouldn't be threatening in normal gameplay become absolutely terrifying. However, your burnout state actually restores faster if you're playing offensively rather than standing there and blocking. In fact, if you use a super move, mainly level 3s, your gauge refills passively while the animation of the super is playing out. On the flip side, if you're getting hit by a super, the burnout gauge stops dead in its tracks. Because of this, it's generally better that if you're gonna go into burnout state, you have to find ways to keep your turn and keep your offense going. This is why you'll see a lot of players use a drive rush cancel from a normal while on less than half a block of drive gauge. If everything is gonna put you into burnout state, it's probably better to get the most expensive option and keep the offense going so you get your drive gauge back sooner. Also, let's talk about stun real quick. Stun is probably the most controversial mechanic in Street Fighter history. Street Fighter 2 attacks would randomly do an amount of stun in a range, meaning that when you hit your opponent with a combo, there is a chance that they would get stunned very quickly. This was changed in later versions of the game and eventually was refined into a system that can be calculated and understood easily. While stunned, you're unable to do anything apart from attempt to mash out, meaning that your opponent can get another free combo on you. Stun honestly sucks, especially in the older Street Fighter games. In Street Fighter 3 and 5, you can literally see your character's stun bar, so you at least get to know when you're close to being stunned. For some reason, they didn't do this in 4, and I don't know why that is. So how does stun work in 6? There's no stun gauge, so do you just get stunned by being attacked too much and you can't see it again? Are the even-numbered Street Fighter games cursed to never let me see how close I am to my demise? No, in fact, the stun gauge is once again tied to the drive system. So we need to go back to drive impact real quick. While drive impact does have the crumple effect, it also has one other quirk. If the opponent blocks it in the corner, they are actually put into a wall slump state. Not unlike wall stick in Guilty Gear Strive. However, when you hit the opponent, now instead of sending them to the Oval Office where they can have a nice conversation with JFK about how they're going to stop the zombie invasion, you actually just get to start a new combo on your opponent for free in the corner, with no wall break. It's kind of funny. However, they don't stick long, meaning that you basically only have time to start with a grounded normal. Now, if you do this interaction while the opponent is in burnout, instead of just putting them into a wall slump state, it actually puts them into a more traditional Street Fighter stun state where they do the funny drunken sway before eating shit on the floor. Because of this, being in the corner while in burnout state is fucking terrifying, but it isn't the end of the world. Unless the opponent manages to do a specific setup, you can generally jump drive impacts on reaction, and you can always use a super to break through their armor and regain control of the situation. Having the EX moves separated from supers helps this too, as you're able to have an alternate resource that you can burn to get out of these situations while still keeping all of the stuff that we talked about earlier. And now, every character has 3 different supers, but we're not here to talk about that. We're here to talk about the funny green bomb. Almost every system in Street Fighter 6 links back to the drive gauge in some way, as the gauge acts as a resource gauge, block gauge, and countdown to your inevitable doom. Because basically everything in a fight affects or relies on the drive gauge in some way, it leads to it being the most important thing in the game, and something that once you start playing at even an intermediate level, you are constantly aware of and thinking about how to use. It's a gameplay system that can be daunting at first, but is deeply engaging and changes how you view the state of a match, even in simple situations. The system is risky and a massive departure from basically all other Street Fighter games. However, the way that the bar is linked to everything means that Capcom has made a system that is utterly genius. As always, a very special thanks to 64 MHz, Almost Nap Time, Pantushitos, Ben from Canada, Brudica, Vantus de Leon, Daniel Wiedericht, Dragonprox, Games.png, I Am Naoto, Jackal Reeves, Lady Dantalon, Melodically Me, Monact, MP04, Nhoa, Ray W, Super, Forcon, Tom Tanks, Voltaic Charge, and Zandatsu for being Tier 2 patron supporters.